We've been in a series as a church called See King Jesus. Our final installment of that series is happening right now. I want you to turn in your Bible to John chapter 20. This is my favorite chapter of people concerning the resurrection of Jesus Christ in the Bible.
Steven Furtick somehow turned a small team and a dream into one of the biggest church empires America has ever seen. Elevation. Church spread across states. Elevation worship conquered the globe, turning him into a full-blown celebrity. But fame has a way of pulling everything into the light, including the things people would rather keep hidden. The mansion raised eyebrows, the theology raised alarms, and the questions have never stopped coming. Is Furtick building something that will last, or is the whole thing beginning to crack under its own weight? Join us as we take a closer look at the man, the ministry, and why things aren't looking good for Pastor Steven Furtick. The pastor who built a modern empire. Every Sunday, thousands of people fill the seats of Elevation Church. Cameras roll, lights shine bright, and music fills every corner of the building. At the center of it all stands one man, Steven Furtick. He is not the kind of preacher most people grew up watching. He does not stand quietly behind a wooden pulpit, reading from notes. He moves around the stage, raises his voice, and pulls the crowd into every single word he says. His sermons travel far beyond the church walls, spreading across YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, reaching millions of people who have never visited one of his buildings. Elevation Church is one of the largest churches in America, with campuses spread across multiple states and worship music that plays in countries all over the world. The growth has been extraordinary by any measure. But not everyone is impressed. Questions have been growing louder over the years, with critics asking whether Elevation Church is still a ministry or whether it has slowly become something closer to a brand. There are concerns about his personal wealth, concerns about his teaching style, and concerns about the culture inside the church itself. Supporters say he brought a whole new generation back to faith, while critics say he represents everything that has gone wrong with modern Christianity. Both sides feel strongly, and neither side is backing down. The story of Steven Furtick is not a simple one, and it did not begin inside a grand building with spotlights and a crowd of thousands. It began in a small, quiet town in South Carolina, where a boy with a gift for speaking started dreaming about something much bigger than the world around him. The small-town kid from South Carolina. Steven Furtick was born on February 19, 1980, in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, a small and quiet town where life moved slowly, and most people never felt the need to leave. He grew up in a Southern Baptist household, where going to church was simply part of the routine, not something the family debated or questioned. Faith was woven into everyday life, and Sunday services were as regular as any other part of the week. From an early age, Steven stood out. He had a natural ability to speak in front of people, to hold their attention and make them feel something, and that kind of gift does not go unnoticed for long. While other kids were thinking about sports or school, Steven was paying close attention to how church worked and what made people lean forward in their seats. As he got older, he became aware of pastors who were doing things differently, men like Rick Warren, who had built Saddleback Church into something millions of people connected with. Steven studied how these leaders communicated, absorbed everything he could, and began forming ideas of his own. He went on to study at North Greenville University, and later earned a theology degree from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, giving himself the knowledge and the credentials to match the ambition that had been building inside him for years. By the time his studies were finished, the plan was clear in his mind. He did not want to take over an existing church. He wanted to build something completely new, something designed for people who found traditional churches dull or hard to connect with. He chose Charlotte, North Carolina, as the place to start. And what happened next was something very few people saw coming. The birth of Elevation Church. Steven Furtick arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina in the mid-2000s with a small team of people who believed in what he was trying to build. There was no large building waiting for them, no established congregation, and no guarantee that any of it would work. They were starting from nothing. The first service was held in 2006, with only a few hundred people in the room, but Furtick was not discouraged. He had a clear vision for what kind of church Elevation would be, one that felt nothing like the traditional churches most people had grown up attending. Everything about it was designed to feel modern and welcoming. The music was loud and emotionally powerful, the storytelling was personal and easy to follow, and the production quality was high from the very beginning. Social media was still relatively new at the time, but Furtick understood its potential and used it aggressively to spread the message and grow the audience. The growth came fast. Within a few years, attendance had climbed far beyond what most new churches ever reach, and Elevation began opening additional campuses across the region. Sermons were being watched online by people in cities and countries that Furtick had never visited. Traditional churches took notice, some with admiration, and others with deep concern about what this new model of ministry actually meant for the faith. By any measurement, Elevation Church had become a major success story in American Christianity, built on energy, creativity, and one man's belief that church could reach people that the old ways never would. But as the church grew bigger, so did the man leading it, and Steven Furtick was becoming something far larger than just a local pastor. The rise of the Steven Furtick brand. As Elevation Church grew, so did the profile of its founder. Steven Furtick was no longer just a pastor in Charlotte. He was becoming one of the most recognized Christian voices in the entire country. He began writing books, and they sold extremely well. Titles like Sun Stand Still, Crash the Chatterbox, and Unqualified reached bestseller lists and found audiences far beyond the church world. People who had never attended Elevation were reading his words and sharing them widely. His sermon clips were everywhere online. Short moments pulled from his messages spread rapidly across YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, introducing him to younger audiences who consumed content on their phones rather than sitting in a church building. The numbers climbed into the millions and kept going. Elevation Worship, the music ministry connected to his church, became a force of its own. Songs like Graves into Gardens, Jireh, and Do It Again were being sung in churches around the world, streamed billions of times, and performed in arenas packed with tens of thousands of people. For many Christians globally, Elevation Worship was simply part of weekly life. Furtick's preaching style was a large part of what made people pay attention. It was cinematic, emotionally driven, and built around personal stories that ordinary people could connect with. He had a rare ability to make a sermon feel urgent and alive. But the bigger he became, the more scrutiny followed. Critics began pointing out that his messages sometimes felt closer to motivational speaking than to traditional biblical teaching, and that the line between ministry and celebrity was getting harder to see. The fame was real, the influence was undeniable, and the questions were only just beginning. One of the loudest questions had nothing to do with his sermons at all. It had to do with where he lived. The mansion controversy. At some point, the public became aware that Steven Furtick had built a very large home on a heavily wooded property in North Carolina. The details that emerged painted a picture of a lifestyle that many people felt sat uncomfortably alongside the message he preached every week. Reports described the property as expansive, with the home itself sitting on a significant amount of land. The reaction was immediate and intense, with people across Christian media and beyond asking the same question: how does a pastor end up living like this? The criticism landed hard. Some voices accused Furtick of living out a prosperity gospel, the belief that faithful Christians are rewarded with financial success, a teaching that many theologians reject as a distortion of Scripture. Others questioned the financial structure of Elevation Church itself, and whether the congregation had a clear picture of where money was going. Furtick responded by explaining that the home was purchased using income from his books, not from his church salary.
I didn't even build that house with money from the church. I built it with money from my book.
He pushed back against the idea that success should disqualify someone from ministry, and many of his supporters agreed. They argued that authors and public figures earn income legitimately, and that holding a pastor to a different standard was unfair. But the debate did not go away quietly. It spread across podcasts, comment sections, and Christian publications, drawing in voices from all corners of the faith community. For many people, the mansion became a symbol of a much larger concern about wealth, power, and accountability inside modern megachurches. The conversation about money raised even deeper questions about what Furtick was actually teaching from the stage every Sunday, and whether his theology was as solid as his following suggested. The theology debate. While the mansion controversy was still fresh in people's minds, another set of concerns was quietly building, and this one went much deeper than real estate. Critics began taking a closer look at what Steven Furtick was actually teaching from the pulpit, and many of them did not like what they found. Theologians and pastors from more traditional backgrounds started raising serious objections, pointing to sermons that emphasized personal success, abundance, and the power of speaking positive things into existence. To their ears, it sounded less like the gospel and more like self-help with scripture sprinkled on top. Specific sermon clips were pulled apart online, shared widely, and used as evidence that Furtick was drifting away from solid biblical teaching. Some critics went further, accusing him of emotional manipulation, suggesting that his cinematic preaching style was designed to make people feel something rather than understand something. Furtick and his supporters pushed back firmly. They argued that his approach was reaching people that traditional church had completely failed to connect with, particularly younger generations who had grown up switching off the moment a sermon became dry or difficult. Emotional preaching, they said, was not automatically dishonest preaching. The divide became very clear. On one side sat pastors and theologians who believed depth and accuracy mattered above everything else. On the other side stood millions of people whose lives had genuinely been changed by what they heard at Elevation. People who found the criticism cold and disconnected from reality. Neither side was entirely wrong, and that is what made the debate so difficult to settle. What almost everyone agreed on, however, was that Elevation worship had done something remarkable, something that had quietly grown bigger than the church itself. Elevation worship changes Christian music forever. Even people who had strong opinions about Steven Furtick's preaching often found it difficult to argue with what Elevation worship had achieved. The music coming out of his church had become something genuinely extraordinary. Elevation worship began as the in-house band for the church, a group of musicians and singers creating original songs to support Sunday services. But it did not stay small for long. The music traveled far beyond Charlotte, finding its way into churches of every denomination, in countries across every continent, sung by people who had never heard of Steven Furtick and had no idea where the songs came from. Praise, Jireh, and Do It Again became some of the most recognized worship songs of the entire generation. They were streamed billions of times, covered by other artists, and performed at events that filled arenas to capacity. Grammy recognition followed, confirming what the streaming numbers had already been saying for years. But success at that scale always invites scrutiny. Critics began asking uncomfortable questions about the worship industry and whether something sacred had become something commercial. Ticketed concert events, high production budgets, and the sheer scale of the operation led some people to wonder whether the line between worship and entertainment had disappeared entirely. Others rejected that framing completely, arguing that powerful music had always moved people toward God, and that production quality did not make an experience less genuine. The debate around Elevation worship mirrored the wider debate around Furtick himself, inspiring to millions, deeply concerning to others, and impossible to ignore either way. Through all of it, the man at the center kept preaching, kept building, and kept growing. But the pressure that came with that level of fame was beginning to show. Fame, pressure, and public scrutiny. Being one of the most watched pastors in the world comes with a weight that most people never have to carry. And over time, signs of that weight began to appear around Steven Furtick. Social media had turned him into a figure that millions of people felt they personally knew. And with that came constant analysis of everything he said, wore, drove, and posted. Sermon clips were pulled apart in comment sections by critics who treated each one as evidence of something deeper and more troubling. Memes spread. Parody accounts appeared. Every perceived slip became a talking point. Accusations of narcissism surfaced regularly, with some critics pointing to the way Elevation was built so completely around one personality. Others questioned whether certain emotional moments in services were genuine or carefully staged for effect. The branding, the merchandise, the polished aesthetic of everything connected to Furtick's name, all of it fed a narrative that something had gone wrong somewhere along the way. To his credit, Furtick did not pretend the pressure did not exist. He spoke openly about his own struggles with anxiety, insecurity, and the particular loneliness that comes with public life. Those moments of honesty connected deeply with many of his followers, who saw a real person rather than a performer. But the broader cultural moment was also shifting beneath him. The deconstruction movement, in which many Christians began publicly questioning or walking away from their faith, was gathering real momentum, and megachurch culture was one of its most common targets. Trust in large, personality-driven churches was eroding across the country. Furtick was not the only pastor facing these pressures, but as one of the most visible figures in American Christianity, the questions about his church pointed towards something much bigger happening across the entire landscape. The changing future of megachurches. Steven Furtick built Elevation Church during a specific moment in time, a moment when megachurch culture was expanding rapidly, and the idea of a high-energy, personality-driven ministry felt exciting and fresh. But that moment has been shifting, and the landscape around him looks very different now than it did in 2006. Attendance patterns across American Christianity have been changing steadily. Younger generations are walking away from institutional church in growing numbers, not always because they have lost faith entirely, but because they have lost trust in the structures and the leaders. The deconstruction movement gave language to something many people were already quietly feeling, and megachurches became one of the primary symbols of everything they were questioning. At the same time, the way people consume religious content has changed completely. Online sermons, podcasts, and short clips have replaced physical attendance for a significant number of people. And while Elevation has adapted well to that shift, it raises real questions about what a church actually is when most of its audience never walks through a door. Critics have long argued that megachurches are fragile by design, built around charismatic individuals rather than deep community, and that when the founder eventually steps away, very little remains. Elevation still shows strong digital numbers, but the broader pattern of church decline in America sits uncomfortably in the background. What Furtick has built is genuinely impressive by almost any measure, and the conversation about whether it lasts, whether it serves people well, and whether it represents the future or a passing moment in Christian history remains wide open. That conversation leads directly to the hardest question of all. What kind of legacy is Steven Furtick actually building? And how will history remember him? The legacy question. Steven Furtick is still very much active, still preaching to millions every week, still building and still dividing opinion as sharply as he ever has. The story is not finished, which makes the question of legacy complicated to answer. What he has built is real. Elevation Church grew from a few hundred people in a rented space to one of the most attended and most watched churches in the entire world. Elevation Worship produced music that genuinely changed how a generation sings about faith. His books reached people far outside the walls of any church building, And his online presence continues to grow in ways that most ministries could never compete with. Millions of people say he helped them find God, or find their way back to God. And that is not a small thing. Those stories are real too, and they deserve to be taken seriously. But the concerns are real as well. The questions about wealth, accountability, theology, and the dangers of building a ministry so completely around one personality have never been fully answered. They sit alongside the success, unresolved and uncomfortable. The truth is that Steven Furtick probably represents both things at once: a genuinely gifted communicator who opened doors for millions of people, and a symbol of the tensions and contradictions built into modern megachurch culture. Whether history remembers him as a visionary who modernized faith, or as a cautionary tale about celebrity Christianity, may depend entirely on what happens next, and nobody knows what that looks like yet. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.